My name is Iris Wentworth. The day she looked me in the eyes and called me just his ex-wife's shadow, something inside me cracked, but didn't shatter. No, it hardened. I had been quiet for too long. This story isn't one I ever imagined myself telling. I'm not dramatic by nature, not prone to revenge. I was the kind of woman who baked my son's birthday cakes from scratch, ironed his school uniforms, stayed late at work so I could afford his piano lessons. I never raised my voice, never demanded credit. But apparently, in this family, silence is confused with insignificance. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because what happened after I was shut out of my own family isn't just about money, it's about memory identity, and what happens when you let quiet women get angry in peace. It all began the summer my son David got remarried. I was happy for him, truly. I'd met the woman, her name was Simone. She was beautiful, quick-witted, and always perfectly dressed. The kind of woman who knew exactly where the salad fork went. But beneath her flawless veneer was something I couldn't quite touch. A coldness. Still, I smiled at the wedding. I danced at the reception. I offered to take care of their new baby when she came. I wasn't trying to compete with Simone. I just wanted to stay close to David. The first sign something had shifted came slowly, like fog creeping into a warm room. Phone calls became texts. Texts became delayed replies. Then the silence. When I asked to visit the baby, there was always an excuse. Simone had yoga. David was working late. The baby had a fever. I offered to bring groceries to help with laundry. No reply. I remember one Sunday afternoon driving over with a small basket of fresh strawberries and homemade jam. It was my way of showing up without imposing. When I knocked, Simone opened the door just wide enough to see her eyes, and the expression in them chilled me. "Oh, hi." Her tone was the kind you reserve for strangers selling solar panels. "I was just in the neighborhood," I said. "Thought I'd drop this off for Emily." Her eyes narrowed. "Thanks, but we don't really do sugar anymore." I smiled gently. "It's just fruit." She sighed, glanced over her shoulder, and said, "Look, Iris, we appreciate you wanting to help, but we're trying to create our own space. David's past needs boundaries." "Okay." I blinked. His past. That's when she said it lightly, like a throwaway joke. "You're just his ex-wife's shadow. And honestly, shadows make babies cry." She shut the door. I stood on the porch for a full minute before walking back to my car. I didn't cry. I didn't call David. I just sat in the driver's seat and stared at the little jar of jam still warm from my kitchen. A week later, my bank app refused to load. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I'd been a banker my whole life. I understood systems fail. But then came the emails about login attempt errors and account changes. I double-checked the joint fund I had once shared with David, part of a trust account for Emily's education. Access denied. I called the hotline. "Ma'am, it appears your authorization has been revoked." I hung up, and I understood. It wasn't just the front porch Simone had closed to me. It was the entire architecture of our lives, every shared memory, every financial bond, every right. I had to be part of that child's future. Simone had cut me off. David had let her. I sat by my window that evening as the sun dipped behind the hills and thought back to my years at the bank. I wasn't just a teller. I had helped design investment portfolios for small business owners. I'd overseen accounts worth more than this house. I knew how wealth worked. I knew how silence worked too. And if they thought I was just going to vanish, they had forgotten who raised David to begin with. The morning after that realization, I pulled out my old black ledger. It was a habit from my years in banking, keeping everything in writing, cross-checked, reconciled. Even after retiring, I kept the practice alive. It made me feel grounded. Numbers don't lie. And memories, well, they tend to blur. I flipped through the pages of notes, transactions, and trust agreements until I found what I was looking for. The original joint trust contract I had created for my granddaughter, Emily. It had been built on a custodial model, my name as the primary controller, David as a secondary access holder. I had funded it with $62,000 from my savings. No lawyer had changed that. Not yet. And if Simone had managed to manipulate David into believing they could lock me out without consequence, they were sorely mistaken. But I didn't move fast. No, I watched first. A week passed. Then 2. I received no calls. No thank you note for the gift I'd left on the porch. No photos of Emily, who was now nearly 6 months old. The digital photo frame I'd once set up in David's old room stayed frozen on a picture from Christmas 2 years ago. David laughing, holding a glass of mulled wine. Simone off to the side, already pregnant, though we hadn't known it at the time. On a quiet Thursday morning, I got a call from a familiar number. My granddaughter's daycare. Mrs. Wentworth, the woman said. Yes, I replied, standing up straighter in my kitchen. There was just a small mix-up with the automatic tuition payment. It didn't go through this month. I know you've always handled that account, so I wanted to reach out directly. Ah, there it was. I see, I said evenly. Let me look into it. I hung up, then reached for my phone and made one call to Charles Hanley. Charles had been the bank's general counsel for over 25 years. He was crusty brilliant, and the kind of man who believed in ironclad documentation more than he believed in coffee. When he picked up, he greeted me warmly. Iris, are you finally ready to come out of retirement? I chuckled. Not quite. But I have a little situation. When I explained the revoked access and my concern over the misuse of the trust account, he asked one question. Do you still have primary ownership? I do, I said. And the backup copy of the contract in my safe. Then you're still in control. Would you like me to execute a temporary freeze? Yes, I said softly, and I'd like it silent. He chuckled darkly. Just like old times. Within 48 hours, the account was locked. I didn't hear anything for another week until Saturday morning came knocking. Literally, I was sipping my tea in the sunroom when a loud knock echoed through the house. I rose slowly and opened the door to see Simone disheveled for once. No makeup, hair frizzy, and panic in her eyes. Iris, hi, she said, voice brittle with false cheer. David's at the gym with Emily and, we've just had a bit of a hiccup with the trust account. It seems there's some issue with the payments. I wasn't sure if something expired or... She smiled with teeth, but it didn't reach her eyes. I sipped my tea and let the silence hang for a moment. Simone, I said gently, did David explain how that account works? She faltered. Well, he said it was for Emily's future and that I created it. I interrupted. That it was funded by me, built by me, and protected by documents with my name in bold at the top. Her face dropped half a shade. And that while I invited both of you to use it for Emily's benefit, it was never yours to control. She cleared her throat. I didn't mean to offend you. It's just, there's been a mistake. No, I said, there's been a series of choices, and now there are consequences. Her eyes narrowed. You can't just freeze it. That's our daughter's future. I nodded slowly. Yes, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure it's used for her future. Not for your yoga classes, your spa packages, or your attempts to erase me. Her face flushed with color, a furious red, climbing from her collarbone to her cheeks. I'm her mother, she snapped. And I'm her grandmother, I replied. Not raising my voice, who paid for her future while you paid for the locks to keep me out. For a moment we stared at each other. She blinked first. She turned to leave, muttering something I didn't catch. I closed the door before the anger in me boiled over. Later that day, I checked my mailbox. There was a birthday card from David. Inside, a $25 gift card to a bookstore I hadn't visited in years. No note, no signature. Just a gesture, an empty one. That night, I sat on my back porch and watched the stars inch across the darkened sky. I thought about Emily, this little girl growing up in a house full of unspoken things. I thought about the kind of woman she might become. And I made a promise to myself. If they wouldn't let me in, I would watch from a distance but never be blind. If they locked me out, I would own the key to every vault they relied on. I didn't need permission to protect what was mine. I just needed patience. And I had plenty of that. A few days after Simone's unannounced visit, I received a text from David. It was simple, almost hollow in tone. Hey, Mom. Simone told me you had concerns about the trust account. Maybe we can talk sometime this week. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had already been done. I stared at the screen for a long time, then placed my phone face down. Something had shifted in David. Once my son would have called immediately, would have rushed to reassure me that no harm was intended. Now he texted like someone sending a message to a landlord about a broken pipe. I replied the next day. "We can talk when you're ready to speak with honesty. Let me know." No answer. I went about my week as if nothing had happened. I replanted the roses in the front garden. I hosted book club with the women from the library. But beneath it all, a quiet current of awareness buzzed in me. They thought I'd just unfreeze the account once emotions cooled, that I'd chalk it up to miscommunication and let things return to normal. But what they failed to understand was this. I was no longer interested in returning to any version of normal where I was sidelined. Then came the mail that cracked the next layer open. A formal invitation, glossy cream-colored paper, gold-embossed text. Emily Margaret Wentworth baptism ceremony and celebration. Date: this coming Saturday. Venue: a garden club I knew well, intimate upscale. Time: 3 p.m. At the bottom in delicate script it read, hosted by David and Simone Wentworth. And just beneath that, we kindly ask that guests respect our desire for a peaceful and immediate family-only event. There was no envelope for me, just a photocopy of the invite in a blank mailer. I wasn't invited, I was informed. The message was clear. They wanted me to know I wasn't welcome, that they were moving on without me, that they didn't need me, but they did, and they were about to feel it. That same afternoon, I went into my study and unlocked the tall wooden filing cabinet where I kept all my original documents: the trust, the contingency clause, the notarized amendment that Charles had helped me draft years ago. Then I made another call, this time to a different Charles. Charles Wexler, an estate attorney I had worked with during my years managing legacy accounts for high net worth clients. He was sharp, fast, and not easily rattled. "I need a favor," I said. "For you." He chuckled. "Anything." "What's going on?" "I'd like to shift the custodian of the trust account to a third-party escrow for review. I have concerns about mismanagement." He paused only briefly. "You've got primary authority." "I do." "Then I'll make the arrangements by morning." And Charles the Fi added, quietly, "Understood." By Friday, the process was in motion. The account had not only been frozen, it was now under legal audit. Any disbursement, any attempt to alter ownership would now require formal filings and transparency. That night, I drove past the garden club around 10 p.m. The lights were already strung along the hedges. Tables dressed in white cloth stood ready for tomorrow's celebration. A tall floral arch had been constructed near the central fountain. The air smelled like peonies and expensive illusion. I sat there for a long time, engine off, watching. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. This was a house built on reputation. Simone's curated image of success, grace, perfection. She didn't just want to raise a daughter. She wanted to stage a life. And I had no intention of ruining the baptism. No, that would be too loud. Too obvious. Instead, I made one more move. I walked into the bank early the next morning, just after opening, and met with the assistant branch manager, a young woman named Aisha I had mentored before retiring. We sat in her office, and I handed her the folder. "These are formal instructions," I said, "for account control, interest redirection, and a flag on any movement beyond educational or medical expenses." Aisha read through the document carefully. "You're asserting full authority," she said, her brow raised. I nodded. "And protecting what's mine," quietly. She looked at me with admiration. "Simone won't like this." "She doesn't have to," I said. As I walked out, I noticed a sign taped beside the teller window. Saturday closing at 1 p.m. due to private event. The bank had sponsored the baptism. Of course. Still, by the time Simone stepped up to the podium at 3:14 p.m. and began thanking everyone for coming, the phone in her purse was already vibrating. An alert. Bank notification. Transaction blocked. Escrow approval pending. A ripple of disruption had begun, and I wasn't even in the room. I spent that afternoon in my own backyard in my sun hat pruning the lavender. The breeze was light, the sky cloudless. Birds chirped overhead. Somewhere across town, the celebration was likely still unfolding. Champagne flutes clinking. Smiles posing for perfect photographs. But beneath all that gloss, the foundation had cracked. And only one person knew exactly where the pressure points were. Me. The aftermath began like a quiet tremor too faint for outsiders to notice, but unmistakable to those at the epicenter. Sunday morning brought another message from David. This time it was an email. That alone told me how uncomfortable he was. David hated emails unless it was business-related. Subject: Trust account clarification. Mom. Simone told me you've taken steps regarding Emily's account. I'm not sure why this is happening. We've been trying to manage everything responsibly. I think we should sit down and talk this out for Emily's sake. David. I reread it twice. No apology. No ownership. Just deflection cloaked in concern. I let it sit in my inbox. By Monday, the requests turned into pressure. Simone called 3 times that day. I didn't answer. I needed them to sit in the silence, to feel the coldness of being cut out the same cold I had felt on that front porch. Tuesday brought a knock at my door, but it wasn't either of them. It was my granddaughter's pediatrician, Dr. Singh, a gentle man with kind eyes who had treated Emily since birth. He had once told me during a checkup that he remembered me from the bank and that he trusted me more than most lawyers. Mrs. Wentworth, he said carefully, I've been asked to submit a reimbursement through Emily's trust for some upcoming appointments, but I've received notice that it's been flagged for auditing. I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should know. I thanked him and assured him that Emily's health would never suffer for adult mistakes. But even as I said it, I saw what was coming. Simone and David had assumed that cutting me out of family photos, family events, and financial decisions wouldn't ripple outward. But when you try to erase the person who built the structure you now live in, the lights start to flicker. Later that night, I found myself looking through an old photo album. Not digital paper, linen-bound with photos slightly curled at the edges. There was David at age 6 standing with a medal from a spelling bee. Me behind him, arms draped over his small shoulders. His father absent. Of course. It had always been just the two of us. Until Simone came along and began repainting the narrative like I'd been a background character in his life. As I flipped the pages, one picture slid loose and fluttered to the floor. It was David's college graduation. I had nearly forgotten that day. It rained the whole morning and David's tassel had stuck to his forehead. But he had hugged me so hard afterward, lifting me off my feet like a child again. He had whispered then, "I'll never forget everything you gave up for me." I picked up the photo and sat with it, my hand trembling just slightly. What had happened to that boy? Was he buried beneath the layers of ambition and curated family image? Or had I simply never really known him at all? That question sat with me as I attended my Wednesday yoga class, a quiet, low-impact session I'd picked up last year to manage my arthritis. After class, I ran into Marlene. Marlene was David's old high school English teacher, now semi-retired. She had always adored David and followed his life like he was still one of her star students. "Did you see the article?" she asked, pulling out her phone. "What article?" She handed it to me. There, on the glossy digital page of the Green Valley Community Monthly, was a featured story, Modern Family Spotlight. The Wentworths' commitment to financial literacy for the next generation. I didn't need to read past the subheading to feel my jaw set. It was a promotional piece clearly planted, likely by Simone, painting a portrait of their little family as fiscally wise, community-minded, and self-sufficient. It referenced a multi-generational educational fund created by the parents and how their financial discipline would inspire others. Not once did it mention my name. Not once did it acknowledge who had started the fund, structured it, protected it. It was as if I had never existed. I handed the phone back without a word. Marlene gave me a side glance. "You okay?" I nodded. Better than ever. That night, I asked Charles Wexler to draft a brief statement for media correction. It wasn't a threat. It was a footnote. A quiet reminder that the legal custodian of the fund was still me, and that the narrative being projected wasn't just false. It was actionable. I didn't send it to the paper. I sent it to David. 2 hours later, he called. I let it ring. He called again. Then again. Finally, on the 4th try, I picked up. "Mom," he said, breathless. "What the hell are you doing?" "What I should have done months ago," I replied evenly. "You're making this public." "No," I said. "But if you continue to let her rewrite history, I will." He was silent for a moment, then quieter. "Simone didn't mean to cut you out. But she did, I replied. And you let her. I thought it would just be easier to let things be peaceful. Peace built on erasure isn't peace, David. It's silence. And silence only serves those who already hold power. I could hear his breath hitch. I never wanted it to be like this. I know, I said. But that doesn't mean you didn't let it happen. He didn't respond. After a pause, I added, I'm not your enemy, David. But I won't be your footnote either. Then I hung up. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. By the end of that week, David stopped calling. Not out of defiance, but retreat. The kind of silence that follows when someone realizes the bridge they burned wasn't a dead end, but the road home. I didn't expect reconciliation, not yet. But I did expect movement. And movement came just not from David. It came from Simone. I found her waiting on my porch Saturday morning, leaning against the white column like she belonged there. She wore dark sunglasses and a sharp pantsuit that looked entirely out of place in our quiet neighborhood. In her hand was a lavender envelope. She didn't wait for an invitation to speak. I came to apologize. Her voice was flat, controlled, like she had practiced it in the mirror. I opened the screen door slowly and stepped out onto the porch with her. For what exactly? I asked, folding my arms. For everything, she said vaguely. The way things unfolded. The misunderstandings. The account. The party. David. Me. All of it. That's not an apology, Simone, I said calmly. That's a word cloud. She flinched just slightly. I want to fix this, she said, holding the envelope out. It's a letter I wrote to Emily. For the future. I want you to read it. I didn't take it. Instead, I gestured to the chair opposite me. To my surprise, she sat. We sat there in silence for a full minute. Then I said, I don't need your letter, Simone. I need your honesty. She looked down, then up. Fine, she said bitterly. I wanted you out of the picture. You represented a part of David's life I didn't control. You made him nostalgic, sentimental. And I thought if I could cleanly cut that away, I could shape the rest. I stared at her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She was confessing. And the trust. I asked. I thought it would eventually be mine to manage. I assumed that's what David wanted. But clearly, her voice trailed off. He followed, I said. You led. And now, she snapped. Now you've frozen everything. Blocked the tuition. Made us look unstable. No, I replied. I made you visible. She blinked. You wanted control without accountability. You wanted influence without responsibility. That's not family, Simone. That's power. There was a long pause between us. She finally whispered, You're not who I thought you were. I'm exactly who you hoped I wasn't, I said. She stood up slowly. Her hand still held the letter. I stood too. Give that to Emily yourself, I told her. I can't, she said, voice cracking. She doesn't even know who I am yet. Then you have time to change that, I said. But it starts by knowing who you are now. She didn't reply, just nodded stiffly and left the envelope on the porch table. After she left, I didn't touch it. Not yet. I went back inside and sat in my sunroom. The light was pouring through the windows, the kind of golden clarity that only autumn mornings seem to bring. It made the dust in the air look like falling stars. I reached for a pen and opened my journal. It was time to rewrite my own will. I had always intended to leave Emily the trust, but now I wanted more than money in her future. I wanted legacy, so I began drafting a clause. To my granddaughter, Emily Wentworth, I leave not just this fund, but a record of who created it, why, and what it cost. Because one day Emily would grow curious. One day she'd wonder why her family didn't speak of me often. And when that day came, I wanted her to know. I didn't walk away. I was pushed. But I turned, stood tall, and walked into my own light. That night, I made one final decision. I reopened the account, but with a caveat. A strict approval system. Only educational or medical withdrawals. All requests would go through the third-party custodian. I sent David a brief email. The trust is active again, but it's protected. I hope you'll raise Emily to respect what was built for her. Not just financially, but morally. Mom. No reply came that night. But the next morning, I found a note at my doorstep. Handwritten. In David's careful script. Thank you. I'm sorry. We forgot who held the foundation. I remember now. No flowers. No fanfare. Just ink on paper. It was enough for now. I walked back inside, folded the letter, and tucked it inside my journal beside the clause I'd written the night before. Then I sat by the window and watched the first leaves of fall spiral down, brushing against the glass as if trying to remind me. Things fall so they can change. And sometimes love returns. Not because it was forced, but because the silence finally spoke louder than the noise. The following weeks passed in a quiet rhythm, too calm, in a way that felt like the air just before a thunderstorm. I didn't hear from David again, though the note stayed folded neatly in my journal, a relic of something almost like contrition. But Simone was not one to lose quietly. The first ripple arrived subtly, like a stone tossed into the shallow end of a still pond. My friend Helen from book club called one afternoon, sounding unusually tight-lipped. "Iris, I wanted to give you a heads up. Simone's been talking about you, whoa, the trust, David, the church. It's not flattering." I let that settle. Helen wasn't one for gossip. If she brought it to me, it was already circulating. What's she saying? Helen exhaled, hesitant. That you're unstable. That you're trying to control David through money. That you've made things hard for the baby. She even mentioned you threatened legal action. I closed my eyes and felt a flicker of something, not sadness, not anger, but the deep, weary ache of being misunderstood by those who were supposed to stand beside you. "Let her talk," I said finally. "The truth doesn't need a microphone." Still, it stung. That night, I took a walk around my neighborhood. The late autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and fallen leaves. Porch lights blinked on one by one like quiet lighthouses, guiding each family back home. It hit me then I was alone, not just physically, but in the way you feel when your presence is no longer a comfort, but a disruption. I had become the ghost haunting their curated life, the inconvenient remnant of a truth they didn't want to reckon with. I paused by the fence of the playground near the elementary school. The swings creaked slightly in the wind, empty, swaying with the kind of melancholy that makes your breath hitch. Would Emily grow up thinking I was the villain in her family's story? Would she ever know what had really happened? The next day, I received an email from the escrow company confirming the first formal request: a reimbursement for Emily's hearing test and vaccinations. Approved. Then another, an invoice from the preschool Simone had chosen. I hesitated. It was a high-end program, far more expensive than necessary. But the paperwork was clean, justified, legitimate. I approved it too. I wasn't here to punish Emily for her parents' choices. But it was the third request that made me pause. A $4,700 charge to a wellness retreat in Sedona. It was labeled as postpartum recovery. The receipts were sloppy spa treatments, luxury lodging, a silk robe. Declined. Within hours, I got a call. It wasn't David this time. It was Simone. She didn't even say hello. "You're unbelievable." "Good morning to you too," I replied, sipping my tea. "That retreat was recommended by my therapist," she snapped. "It's part of my emotional recovery after birth." "That's a medical need." "It's not your recovery account, Simone. It's Emily's future." There was silence on the line. Then venom. "You're doing this to humiliate me." "No," I said, voice even. "You're doing that all on your own. You're a bitter old woman with too much time and too many grudges. David feels sorry for you, you know." "That's interesting," I said. "Because last I checked, he used to feel sorry for himself. Now he feels quiet." "That's progress." She scoffed, a low sound of disbelief. "You really think you've won?" "This isn't a war," I said. "It's a ledger. And yours is full of red." She hung up. I sat with the silence for a long while afterward. And then I began writing. It started as a letter to Emily, but as the pen moved across the page, it turned into something more: a record, a memoir of sorts. Not for publication, not for vindication, but for preservation. I wrote about the joy of raising David, the struggles of single motherhood, the years I worked extra shifts to fund his college, the way he cried when Emily was born, the way Simone looked at me at the wedding like I was a stain on her curtain. And the moment I knew, I mean truly knew, that I would never be seen by her as a person with a name and history. Only a role, an obstacle. I described everything, even the moment on the porch, even the words, "You're just his ex-wife's shadow." I wrote until my hand ached. Then I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in my safety deposit box along with the clause in the will. Someday Emily would read it, and maybe, just maybe, it would help her see clearly through the fog of family mythology. That weekend I hosted a small gathering at my house. Just a few old friends. We drank cider, laughed about things our knees no longer allowed us to do, and danced awkwardly to old music in the living room. And for the first time in a long while, I felt light. Not victorious, not smug, just unburdened. Later that night, I stood at the window and watched the wind sweep through the maple tree in my front yard. The last of the leaves let go and spiraled down to the earth. Some things need to fall before they can root again. Let them fall. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The silence grew thick again, but this time it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like insulation. A boundary I had finally earned. There were no more spa receipts. No confrontational calls. David didn't write. Simone didn't show up. For the first time in months, the tension wasn't clawing at my door. I filled my days with quiet rituals. Long walks in the park, calls with my friend May, afternoons tending to my winter bulbs. I found a strange sort of freedom in being unnecessary to those who once took me for granted. But it was during one of these walks that I encountered someone I hadn't expected. It was Emily's nanny, Rebecca. A sweet young woman in her 20s who had always greeted me kindly when I visited before the falling out. She was pushing Emily's stroller down the main sidewalk near the coffee shop. When she saw me, she froze. Then she smiled gently. "Iris," she said, a little unsure. "Rebecca," I nodded. "How's she doing?" "Emily's doing well," she said quickly. "She's talking more now. Always asking for stories." We stood in that small pocket of time, two women who loved the same little girl, albeit from very different places. Then Rebecca hesitated. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." She lowered her voice. "I don't know if I should say this, but Emily knows who you are. She points to the photo of you and David that's still in the hallway. She calls you Grammy Iris." My throat tightened. "She misses you," she added. "She doesn't know what happened, but she remembers." I swallowed the ache that bloomed in my chest. "Thank you, Rebecca. That means more than you know." We didn't speak further. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Emily's forehead where she slept soundly, then continued my walk. But that moment followed me like a soft echo the rest of the day. Later back home, I sat with a box of mementos, old photos, cards, tiny drawings David had made in first grade. I found the one he gave me after his first day of school. Crayon scribbles spelling, "My mom is the smartest." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the boy who wrote those words had grown into a man who let his wife make me invisible. But for the first time, I didn't feel bitter. I felt mournful. I mourned what could have been, what still might be, but most importantly, what I had finally stopped clinging to. That night, I wrote a letter, not to David, not to Simone, to Emily, my sweet girl. If you're reading this, it means you're old enough to ask questions, old enough to wonder why your grandmother wasn't there in all your pictures, or at your school plays or your graduation. The truth is, I wanted to be. I loved you before you even had a name. I stitched your first quilt by hand. I painted your nursery with soft lilac stars. I whispered your name to the moon before you were born. But life is complicated. Grown-ups make mistakes. And sometimes people try to erase others, not because they're cruel, but because they're scared. Scared of what truth looks like when it's inconvenient. But I never stopped loving you. I protected your future the best way I knew how. Quietly. I hope you've grown into a woman who asks hard questions and doesn't accept half answers. When you find this letter, know this. You were never the reason for the silence. You were the reason I spoke up. With love that never faded. Grammy Iris. I folded the letter and tucked it into the same safety deposit box as the clause, the journal, and the photos. It didn't fix everything. It wasn't meant to. But it gave shape to the truth, and that was enough for me. A week later, I attended the winter fundraiser at the library where I used to work. As I entered the foyer, I saw familiar faces, people who remembered me not as David's mother or Simone's obstacle, but simply as Iris, the woman who championed reading hours and ran the silent auction like a general in heels. Near the back by the snack table, I spotted Charles Hanley, my old friend from the bank. "You're glowing," he said with a smirk. "I'm done," I replied. "Done with what?" "With chasing an apology that will never come." He raised a glass. To letting the silence speak. We toasted with sparkling cider. And in that moment I felt it, that soft humming peace that comes not from victory, but from reclaiming yourself. Not in their eyes, not in society's ledger, but in your own, and that finally was enough. Winter settled over the town like a long, slow breath. The first snow dusted the rooftops by mid-December, and for the first time in years, I didn't put up a Christmas tree. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. The holidays had always been a time when I'd stretch myself thin, buying the perfect gifts, planning the dinners, trying to recreate a sense of magic for people who no longer invited me into their Decembers. But this year, I did something different. I booked a small cottage by the lake. Just me, a stack of old novels, and a fireplace that didn't require anyone else's approval to light. Before I left, though, I received one final gift from the past year. It arrived in the form of an email from David. Subject: Emily's drawing. Mom, Emily made this in preschool today. The teacher asked them to draw their families. She drew you. She said that's Grammy Iris. She gives the stars names. I don't know where she heard that. Or maybe I do. I know there's still distance, and I don't expect you to forget anything that's happened. But thank you for protecting her, even when it meant we lost you for a while. Love, David. Attached was a scan of a crayon drawing stick figures with wide beaming smiles. One of them had a halo of gray hair, above her stars. Dozens of them, and underneath scrawled in unsteady preschool script, Grammy Iris. My chest tightened and the tears came before I even realized they'd formed. She remembered. Somewhere beneath all the manipulation, the silence, and the estrangement, a child remembered the warmth. And in that moment, I realized something else. Legacy is never in the headlines. It's in the whispers, in the way a child clutches a photo, in the stories they tell about you when no one else is listening. At the cottage, I lit the fireplace on Christmas Eve and poured myself a small glass of port. Snow danced outside the window. Inside it was silent but full, like a room holding its breath after the last note of a song. I thought of all the things I'd carried this year. The betrayal, the dismissal, the erasure, but also the fight, the quiet dignity, the justice. And I realized revenge had never been the goal. Reclamation was taking back the part of me that had been flattened into a title. Ex-wife, grandmother, obstacle. Now I was just Iris again. Whole. Witnessed. Unapologetic. I added a final entry into my journal that night. Let them think I was forgotten. Let them erase my name from the family group chats, the Christmas cards, the seating charts. But they'll never erase the way I made them pause. They'll never forget how the money stopped flowing, how the silence became truth. One day, Emily will find the box. She'll read my letters, and she'll understand. I didn't disappear. I just stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. And when I did, I finally painted myself in. As I closed the journal, the fire crackled. Not a blaze, not a storm, just a steady flame. And in its warmth, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Home. The new year rolled in with quiet dignity. No loud parties, no champagne countdowns. Just the soft chime of the grandfather clock in my hallway, striking midnight as I sat alone with a quilt on my lap and a teacup growing cool in my hand. I used to fear solitude. I used to mistake it for abandonment. Now I understood the difference. Solitude was chosen. Abandonment was inflicted. What Simone did, what David allowed, was abandonment. But what I was living now, this was sovereignty. I spent New Year's Day walking the garden paths at Maple Grove Conservatory. The air was brisk, but the sun was warm on my cheeks, and the skeletal beauty of winter's bare trees no longer struck me as empty. They seemed honest, unashamed of their bareness. A young woman stopped me by the rose bushes. I recognized her, one of the volunteers from the library fundraiser. "Excuse me," she said shyly, "are you Mrs. Iris Wentworth?" I nodded. She smiled. "My grandmother talks about you all the time. Says you're the reason she kept her house during the foreclosure scare last year." Said you helped her navigate the paperwork after the bank refused to explain it. I blinked. That had been almost 5 years ago. I remembered the woman Ruthie, late 70s, hands always cold from poor circulation, but with a mind as sharp as any analyst I'd worked with. She says you're a quiet hero, the girl continued. I just thought you should know. I thanked her and she walked away. But I stood still for a long time. A quiet hero. Was that what I'd become? I didn't know if the word hero fit, but the word quiet. Yes. That one sat comfortably on my shoulders now. A few days later, I received a package at my front door. It was hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a small brown photo album bound in leather and a note written in Simone's unmistakable script. I thought you should have these. She asks about you every week now. And David. He's listening more than talking these days. We're not ready, but we're learning. Thank you for not slamming the door even when we deserved it. Simone. I opened the album. Inside were photos of Emily, her first birthday Halloween, in a bumblebee costume, holding a glitter glue Mother's Day card in her tiny hands. One photo in particular stopped me cold. Emily standing in front of the framed photo in the hallway, the one with me and David. Her small hand rested on the glass, pointing up at my face, a blurred smile on her lips. Someone had captured it without her knowing. I traced my finger across the image, and I smiled. Sometimes love isn't loud. It's a seed buried deep under cold soil, trusting that one day light will return. And here it was, sprouting. I called Charles Wexler the next morning. I want to revise the will, I said. To cut them out. He asked, cautious but unsurprised. I paused. No, I said slowly. To add something. He waited. I want a clause that gives Emily access to the trust only after she reads the letters I've written. All of them. And signs a statement that she understands the origin of the funds. I don't want her growing up with the same curated myths that erased me. Charles chuckled. You always were 10 moves ahead. No, I said. I just know how stories get rewritten when no one keeps the original manuscript. That afternoon, I pulled out the worn journal again. I added more entries, this time about forgiveness. Not the kind that excuses, the kind that remembers then releases. Forgiveness not for David or Simone's sake. For Mina, because the longer I lived with this weight on my shoulders, the more I realized that revenge had already been served the moment they realized I no longer needed to be in their lives to hold power over them. They were reacting to my silence more than I ever reacted to their insults. That's the beautiful paradox of grace. It doesn't have to scream to be heard. By the end of the week, I'd compiled everything. The letters, the financial addendum, the updated instructions. I placed them in a fireproof box labeled simply, "For Emily when the time is right." And I placed it on the highest shelf in my walk-in closet. Then I did something I hadn't done in nearly a year. I baked. My old lemon shortbread recipe, complete with the powdered sugar stars on top. Not because anyone was coming over. Not because I was trying to impress or console anyone, but because I wanted the house to smell like softness again. The moment I pulled them from the oven, the scent wrapped itself around the rooms like an old friend. And I laughed deep freely. I wasn't erased. I wasn't bitter. I was still here. Still Iris. Still standing. Still whole. February arrived like a hush. Not with the usual chill of winter's deep end, but with a surprising softness. The kind that blankets everything, not in silence, but in stillness. A kind of exhale. I had fallen into a rhythm, one that didn't involve David's check-ins or Simone's drama. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up expecting conflict. I woke up expecting peace. Until one evening, as the last of the light left the sky, I received an unexpected visitor. David. He stood at the edge of my porch, his coat dusted with snow, hands deep in his pockets. He looked older somehow, or maybe just more uncertain. I opened the door without a word, stepping back to let him in. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. The air between us was thick but not hostile, just full of things unsaid. He followed me into the kitchen where the kettle was already on. I didn't ask why he came. I simply set down 2 mugs and waited. I read your letters, he said, finally, his voice low. My hands paused. All of them. He nodded. The one to Emily. The one to me. Even the one you wrote after my graduation. the one I never saw. I looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time in years, I didn't see the man who had stood beside Simone while she closed the door in my face. I saw the boy who had once cried into my shoulder because a classmate had called him nothing special. I didn't know, he continued. I didn't know how much you were still holding. You didn't want to know, I said gently. You let her make it easy to forget me. He didn't argue. I was scared, he admitted. Of confrontation, of what Simone would do, of losing the fragile peace we had. And you thought sacrificing me would buy you that peace? I said. I thought you were strong enough to survive it. That of all things made me flinch, because it was true. He had counted on my strength to endure his weakness. And I had delivered. I poured the tea. The scent of chamomile filled the space like a balm. David sat down. Emily talks about you more now. I think she's piecing together that something isn't right. That someone's missing. I nodded. Children always know. They're just waiting for adults to admit it. He sipped his tea, then said, Simone, she's different lately. Softer, maybe? Or just tired. She's never had to sit with consequences, I said. Now she has. David looked up. Do you hate her? I shook my head. No, I pity her. He looked surprised. She's so desperate to curate the perfect life, I continued, that she forgot the mess is where the meaning is. And when you try to erase the mess, you erase the people who helped build you. He exhaled. I think she's scared you'll tell Emily everything one day. I will, I said. Not to poison her. To protect her. From a life built on illusion. He nodded slowly. Then quietly, would you consider coming to dinner? Just the three of us. No expectations. No performances. Just a beginning. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked why now. David looked down into his cup. Because I finally realized that keeping Emily from you didn't make her safer. It made her story smaller. And she deserves the whole story, even the parts that make us uncomfortable. That more than anything reached me. So I said yes. That Saturday evening, I stood at their front door again. But this time, I wasn't holding jam and I wasn't trying to be welcomed. I was being invited. Simone opened the door. She looked tired but not resentful. Hi, she said simply. Hello. Emily ran up behind her tiny hands, grabbing at the air. Grammy Iris. She wrapped her arms around my legs and I crouched slowly to hug her back, careful not to let the tears reach my eyes. Dinner was quiet. Awkward at first. But then Emily spilled juice on Simone's blouse and we all laughed. Something broke open in that moment, a space we didn't know we could still share. After dessert, Emily climbed into my lap with a book and whispered, Will you read it like you used to? My voice caught in my throat. I read, softly, steadily, like I never stopped. Later that night, walking back to my car, David followed me. Thank you, he said, for giving us this chance. You don't owe me thanks, I replied. You owe Emily the truth. Keep choosing it. He nodded. As I drove away, snow began to fall, slow, soft, unhurried. It didn't blanket the past. It didn't erase the damage, but it softened the edges. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Spring took its time that year. The thaw didn't come with sudden warmth or bursts of green, but rather in slow drips, icicles, falling one by one, tiny buds peeking from branches like cautious dreamers. And in many ways, my relationship with David followed the same rhythm. We didn't become close overnight, but we became present. There were calls every Sunday, short, sometimes awkward but consistent. Simone didn't always join, but when she did, she was polite. Measured. There was a visible shift in her tone, no longer icy, but not quite warm either. Somewhere in between. And for now, that was enough. Emily, though, was different. Children don't hold grudges the way adults do. Their hearts are sticky with affection, not judgment. Every time I visited, she threw herself into my arms with the full-bodied joy only toddlers can manage. She called me Grammy Iris with no hesitation, like she had been saying it her entire life. And one afternoon, as we played in the backyard while Simone worked inside, Emily asked me the question I'd been bracing for. Why don't you live here with us? I smiled. Because Grammy has her own home. But you used to, right? Daddy said you used to be here. In a way, yes, I said, crouching beside her. But sometimes grown-ups need space to remember how to be kind again. She blinked at that, then nodded solemnly. Did they forget? I nodded back. Just for a little while. Her tiny hand reached up to touch my cheek. It's okay. I forget stuff all the time. I laughed softly, pulling her close. Me too. That night, I stayed for dinner again. It had started becoming a pattern every other week, a quiet evening shared around a small table with too many forks and not enough clarity, but still something resembling family. And after Emily went to bed, Simone surprised me. She stayed at the table instead of disappearing into the kitchen. Iris, she said, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I've been meaning to tell you something. I looked at her, waiting. I read the journal, she said. The one David found in the deposit box. The entries. The letters. All of it. I didn't flinch. I had always known it would make its way into her hands eventually. I thought it would make me angry, she continued. Like you were trying to take something from me. And, did it? She shook her head. It just made me realize how much I didn't understand. How many rooms I walked into thinking I'd built the house, when really, I was just putting curtains on your foundation. I said nothing. She looked down. I didn't come from women like you. I came from women who wore survival like jewelry, loud, flashy, and sharp-edged. I never knew how to make room for grace. A long pause stretched between us. Then she said almost in a whisper, but I want Emily to learn. That was the first time I truly saw her, not as the polished strategist who had tried to erase me, but as a woman scrambling to rethread her own narrative stitch by fragile stitch. You still have time? I said gently. She looked up surprised. You think so? I know so. Just don't waste it on performance. Emily doesn't need perfection. She needs truth. Her eyes filled not with tears, but with something deeper. Recognition, perhaps? A quiet surrender to the fact that love can't be forced into shape. It has to be earned, shared, lived. That evening, when I returned home, I found myself standing at the threshold of my study, staring at the old box with all the documents and letters tucked safely inside. I opened it one last time, not to change anything, just to read, to remind myself how far I had come. Each page held a piece of me, a woman carved by betrayal, tempered by silence, and strengthened by the kind of resolve that doesn't require revenge to feel full. That night, I added one final page. This journey didn't end when the door was slammed in my face. It didn't end when I froze the bank account. It didn't even end when they asked me back to dinner. It ended when I realized I was never waiting for their apology. I was waiting for my own permission to stop shrinking. And now that I've given it to myself, no one can take it back. I placed the page at the top of the stack and closed the box. Outside, a light rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, like a lullaby, meant only for those who'd made it through the storm. And as I crawled into bed that night, I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt whole, not because everything had healed, but because I had. Spring ripened slowly into early summer. The lilacs bloomed. The dogwood petals drifted like paper confetti onto my front porch steps. Life resumed not as it had been, but as it was meant to be. One morning, I was in my kitchen brewing coffee and humming to myself when the doorbell rang. It was David. But this time, he wasn't alone. Emily stood beside him, her small hand wrapped around his thumb, holding tightly as if she might float away without it. She wore a yellow sundress, her hair in two lopsided braids. And in her other hand was something small and wrapped in tissue paper. We brought you something, David said. I opened the door wider and motioned them in. Let's see it. Emily unwrapped the bundle carefully with all the gravity a 4-year-old could muster. Inside was a small ceramic dish, crooked, imperfect, painted in swirls of lavender and gold. For your rings, she said. I made it at preschool. My throat closed up. I reached down, kissed the top of her head, and said the only thing I could manage. It's perfect. She beamed. David watched me closely. We have a favor to ask, he said after a moment. I raised my brows. We'd like you to be part of her birthday this year, he said. Not just invited. Included. Helping. Planning. Everything. I froze. I hadn't attended the last 2 birthdays. I hadn't been invited to the first one. The second had come with a formality so stiff I'd declined. The pain had been too raw, the air between us still filled with shards. But this time it felt different. Simone's on board, I asked. She suggested it, he replied. That surprised me more than anything. Emily ran into the living room to look at a photo album I'd left on the coffee table. As her laughter echoed down the hall, I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to David. We sat across from each other. I don't want this to be performative, I said carefully. It's not, he replied. We just realized. We've been trying so hard to protect Emily from mess that we forgot to teach her how to clean it up. That struck something deep in me. You don't protect children by hiding the cracks, I said. You protect them by showing them how to patch them. He nodded. We don't deserve your forgiveness, he added. I'm not here to weigh what you deserve, I said. I'm here because I'm her grandmother. He smiled softly, the kind of smile I remembered from his college days. The kind that hadn't been filtered through pride or fear or Simone's watchful eye. A week later, I found myself in Simone's kitchen standing next to her as we decorated tiny cupcakes with pink buttercream. Emily sat on the floor nearby arranging plastic animals into something that looked vaguely like a wedding. She's imaginative, Simone said without looking up. She gets that from her father, I replied. She gets the grace from you. I turned slightly. Simone still didn't look at me, but the way she said it low without edge made it clear she wasn't just filling the silence. I'm trying, she said. I didn't offer praise. I didn't soften. But I said, so am I. At the birthday party held in their backyard under strands of paper lanterns and fluttering balloons, I stood beside Simone as she lit the candles on the cake. Emily bounced with joy, chanting, "Make a wish, Grammy. Make a wish." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I made one. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but for freedom from the weight of needing either. Later that afternoon, I sat under the old magnolia tree as Emily climbed into my lap, a plate of half-eaten cake in her hand. Are you going to come next year too? She asked. If I'm invited, I said. She frowned. You don't need an invitation. You're Grammy Iris. I kissed the top of her head. Across the yard, David and Simone spoke with other parents, laughing, sharing stories. I didn't join them. I didn't need to. I had my place. Not at the center, but not in exile. After everyone left, David helped me gather the leftover decorations. We moved quietly like 2 people who had lived through a long storm and were still learning how to trust the sun. As he tied the trash bag shut, he looked at me. You know, he said, I used to think you were the hardest person in the world to impress. I smirked. I used to think the same about you. He nodded. But I realize now. You weren't trying to be impressive. You were trying to be steady. I just didn't know how to appreciate that yet. Most people don't, I said, until everything else crumbles. He offered a half smile. I hope we haven't waited too long. I looked around the yard, the remnants of joy, the echoes of children's laughter still hanging in the air. No, I said. You're just in time. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, Emily ran back out with a drawing clutched in her hand. Grammy, she yelled. I made a new one. She handed it to me. Another stick figure family. But this time, there were no missing pieces. And beneath it, in shaky, adorable handwriting, one sentence. My family is learning how to love. By midsummer, the rhythms of our lives began to take on a new harmony, familiar but cautiously reassembled. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of their family. I was visible again, not because I demanded it, but because they finally began to see. It was Simone who surprised me next. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. She had asked if we could talk alone. I expected tension, but what came instead was humility. She wore no makeup that day, no mask. Just her natural face and slightly frazzled hair, as though motherhood had finally taught her that authenticity was more powerful than control. I've been thinking, she said, stirring her coffee, about legacy. I waited. I spent the first years of my marriage trying to erase the parts of David that made me feel insecure, she admitted. And you were the biggest part of that. Her honesty didn't stun me. What stunned me was the softness in her voice. I thought if I could cut you out, I'd become the matriarch by default. But all I became was a gatekeeper, and the gate I was guarding wasn't even mine. She looked up. You earned it. And I tried to pretend you hadn't. I said nothing for a moment then. Why now? She smiled faintly. Because Emily is watching, and if I don't show her how to admit when I'm wrong, She'll never learn to do the same. We sat in that silence for a while, the clinking of cups and background cafe music filling the space between our words. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I just want you to know I see it now. All of it. I nodded slowly. I never needed you to see me as perfect. I just needed you to stop pretending I was disposable. I did that, she whispered. Yes, I said gently, but you're trying to undo it. That counts for something. We left the cafe without a dramatic hug or final speech. Just a nod, two women finally walking away from the same battlefield. Back at home, I opened the safety deposit box again. It had become a ritual now. I read the letters. Updated the journal. This time, I added a new entry, one that didn't drip with the ache of abandonment or the fire of justice. This one felt different. I used to believe power was in the freeze, in the moment I locked the account, in the silence that followed. But now I understand real power was never in stopping their story. It was in reclaiming mine, in leaving a paper trail of love for a child who one day will ask, "Where were you when they said you didn't matter?" And the answer will be, I was still here, writing, remembering, refusing to disappear. That weekend, I invited David and Simone to my home for dinner for the first time in over 3 years. Emily helped me set the table. Her little fingers were clumsy but determined. She folded the napkins into odd triangles and placed a wildflower in a chipped mason jar. When they arrived, Simone handed me a dish of roasted vegetables and said, "You still make the best roast chicken. We won't compete." During dinner, we spoke about ordinary things, school updates, books, the neighbor's loud lawnmower. The quiet steadiness of it all was almost surreal. Afterward, we sat on the porch as the cicadas hummed their slow song into the dusk. David sipped iced tea and said, "I'm thinking of starting a fund for other parents. Inspired by you, something that helps single moms build college accounts for their kids." I smiled. "A trust for trust." He laughed. "Exactly." Emily sat between us, sleepy-eyed, and nestled into my arm. She looked up at me and asked, "Will you always be here?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth is, we never really are. Not forever. Not in body. But in story. In impact. In the lessons we etch into the minds of those we love. Yes. That's where we stay. So I kissed her hair and said, "As long as you remember me, I will be." That night after they left, I stood at the window and watched their taillights fade into the distance. No anger remained. No need for control. Just the faint glow of healing flickering like a candle that had been burning quietly in the background, waiting for someone to notice it was still alive. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was guarding something. I felt like I had finally passed it on. Not the account, not the money, but the strength, the knowing, the truth. Summer slid into late August, and with it came the kind of sun that felt softer, more forgiving. The fire of July had faded into a golden warmth that kissed your skin rather than scorched it. The world seemed to breathe more slowly, and so did I. Emily started kindergarten that week. David sent me a photo that morning, her tiny frame in an oversized backpack, one shoe slightly untied, and a determined smile that looked so much like his at that age. It made my chest ache. She asked if you'd walk her to school one day. His message read, "Maybe next week." I stared at the screen for a long while, smiling through tears. This was how you came back from being erased. Not in grand gestures, but in the everyday invitations, the ordinary moments, the ones they used to believe didn't belong to you. The next day, I sat in my garden pruning dead blossoms and making space for new ones. The late summer flowers were beginning to lean, petals curling in quiet surrender. I used to resist this time of year when things began to fall again. It reminded me too much of endings. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't about death. It was about preparation, letting go to make room. Later that afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not a catalog. A real letter, handwritten. It was from Simone, Iris. "I hope you don't mind me writing. I thought it would be better than saying this out loud over dinner. I want you to know that I've started therapy. Real therapy. The kind that digs. And I've realized that my fear of being overshadowed wasn't about you. It was about me not believing I was enough. You've always had this stillness about you. That kind of presence that doesn't beg to be noticed but commands attention all the same. I confused your grace for judgment, but now I see you clearly. You were never trying to take control. You were trying to hold the pieces while the rest of us were busy pretending they weren't breaking. I don't know if we'll ever have the kind of relationship that's soft and simple, but I hope we have one that's honest. I hope Emily grows into a woman who carries your quiet strength. And I hope I learn to do the same. Simone. I folded the letter and placed it inside the journal. Not because I needed to document it, but because it belonged in the story now. All of it did. The broken pieces, the mended ones, even the ones still jagged around the edges. That weekend I walked Emily to school. She held my hand the entire time, swinging it as we passed mailboxes and garden gnomes, chatting about what she'd packed for lunch and how she hoped her teacher liked stars as much as she did. When we arrived at the school gate, she turned to me and whispered, "Can you come to Grandparents' Day this year?" I knelt down, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." She grinned, kissed my cheek, and ran toward her friends. I watched her go backpack, bouncing laughter trailing behind her like a kite. And then, as I turned to leave, a woman approached me. Another parent. "Are you Emily's grandmother?" I nodded. "She talks about you all the time." The woman smiled. "Says you're the one who names the stars." I felt something catch in my throat. That simple memory, a phrase I had once whispered into the dark when she was a baby in my arms, had stayed with her. I nodded again. "Yes," I said softly. "That's me." As I walked home, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. The kind of breeze that makes you feel like something unseen is passing through, reminding you that you're not alone. I passed by the bench outside the library and paused. I remembered sitting there the day I froze the trust. That was the day I reclaimed myself. But this was the day I forgave the world for not seeing me sooner. I didn't need to be feared or fought over or restored to a pedestal. I just needed to be known. And now I was, not because I had shouted, but because I had stood still and let the truth echo through the silence. The final days of summer passed with the gentle dignity of a woman who's seen every season and knows not to rush the turning. September arrived golden and graceful, and with it came a new rhythm. I hadn't expected one filled with invitation, inclusion, and ease. Emily called every few days now, sometimes with questions. Why do stars twinkle? And sometimes just to say goodnight. David dropped by with groceries he'd picked up too much of. Simone even invited me to help plan the fall school fundraiser. It was strange. Not the events themselves, but the way they no longer felt like olive branches. They were just life. One Thursday evening, as I sat on my porch sipping tea, David arrived with a folder in hand. "I need your signature," he said with a small smile. "Just a formality." I raised a brow. "It's for the new trust," he explained. "The one for single mothers." He handed me the paperwork, and as I read the title, "The Wentworth Grace Fund," I paused. "You named it after me." He shook his head. "Not just you. After what you taught me." I blinked slowly. Grace. Not revenge, not justice, grace. I signed. That night, I returned to the journal, now nearly full, and wrote my final letter to Emily. Not to be opened someday, not to be hidden in a box, but to be read whenever she was ready. Because now I trusted she would be my dearest Emily. When you were born, I was told that I might not have a place in your life. I was told that families evolve, that the past should remain politely in the background. But love does not politely fade. It remains. It roots itself in the quiet even when no one remembers to water it. And someday, when you are standing in your own home with your own children tugging at your sleeve, you may wonder, how do I hold on to myself when the world wants me to be small? And in that moment, I want you to remember me. Not as a grandmother who baked cookies or tied ribbons, though I did, but as a woman who refused to vanish. You carry my name now in stars in silence, in the kind of strength that doesn't need applause. Be kind. Be still. Be fierce. And always, always tell the truth. Love, Grammy Iris. I placed the letter in an envelope and mailed it. Not to a bank, not to a lawyer, but directly to their home. No secrecy, no strategy, just story. A week later, David sent me a photo of Emily reading it aloud at bedtime. Simone beside her, listening with quiet eyes. I didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. The story had finally written itself to its end. One evening, I stood in front of my mirror. For the first time in a long time, I studied my face, not for the lines or the softness around the eyes, but for the peace. I had spent years being erased then, years fighting to be seen. Now I had become something greater, a witness to my own becoming. And the woman staring back at me wasn't just someone's mother, or someone's obstacle, or someone's revenge. She was Iris, whole, weathered, unshaken. And when she smiled, it was soft, because she no longer needed to win. She had simply endured, and in doing so, she had rewritten the ending. Not loud, not vengeful, but unforgettable. There is a unique kind of silence that comes after the storm is long gone. Not the suffocating kind that follows betrayal. Not the stunned kind after heartbreak, but the sacred kind, the kind that feels earned. I live there now, in that silence. It doesn't mean the past didn't happen. The porch door still creaks like it did the day Simone shut it in my face. The bank account still exists. The trust still has rules. But so do I. And my greatest rule now is simple. I no longer ask for space in stories that try to erase me. I write my own. Some nights I still read the letters I once locked away, not to dwell, but to remember how far I climbed. Each word a rung in the ladder I built back to myself. And Emily, she knows. She knows who I am, who I was, and who I chose to be, when the easy thing would have been to disappear. There's power in the freeze. But there's even more in the thaw, because when you reclaim your voice, they hear you even when you whisper. And someday when I'm long gone, Emily will speak of me not just as her grandmother, Nee, but as the woman who taught her that quiet doesn't mean weak. That distance doesn't mean absence. And that love, when rooted deep enough, can grow even through concrete. This was never a story about revenge. It was a story about memory. And now it's hers to keep.